Optimized here. The SCP universe is a vastly powerful verse filled with anomalies that range from a cuddly blob of happiness to a neck-snapping speed blitzing statue. Today, as promised in the weakest SCPs video, I want to talk about the top 5 strongest SCPs. Before we get into it, this video took days to make and I would appreciate it if you subbed. First things first, let's set the rules. I'm not confining this to just SCPs, anything is allowed. Anything or entity mentioned on the SCP English branch could be in this video. The only rule is it has to be in the SCP verse. Another thing is this video goes over some advanced topics, so if you get confused, don't worry. I will have some links in the description to help you understand. There are timestamps for each SCP if you want to jump around. Without further ado, let's get on to the top 5 strongest SCPs. At number 5, I have the Almighty. The Almighty stands atop the tree and is the ultimate ruler of all of the gods. The tree, or the tree of life within the SCP verse, is a tree that contains infinite multiverses. You know this video is fun to research when a baseline is infinite multiverses. Within the tree there are beings like the Scarlet King, who is a threat to the tree and is superior to SCP-3125. The Scarlet King's goal is to destroy creation, the tree, and its creator, the Brother's death. The fight between the Scarlet King and the Brother's death threatens the tree. The thing that made the Brother's death is the Almighty. The Almighty is above the Elder Gods who are being so strong they can accidentally destroy the Tree of Life. Destroying an infinite multiverse is only the surface of the Almighty's power. The war between the Brother's death and the Scarlet King caused physics to break down and the Noosphere to turn in on itself. The Noosphere is a realm of all human knowledge, concepts, and information. The Noosphere is inside the Infosphere, a place full of gigantic ideas living in a hierarchy decided by their size as measured by Aleph numbers. Or simply put, numbers larger than infinite. SCP-3125 is an idea in the Infosphere. At bare minimum, SCP-3125 would be above infinity or Aleph null. I already hear you asking, how do you go past infinity? The answer is the power set of infinity. The power set of infinity is a complex topic, and I'll do my best to explain it using Hilbert's hotel. Let's say there's a hotel with an infinite number of rooms. You might think you can put anyone in the hotel, but you would be wrong. Let's say a bus pulls up with a limitless number of people, uniquely named with an infinitely long name composed of 2 letters in random order. Each name is unique. Let's say you have a spreadsheet with all of these names. You can create a new one by changing the letter diagonally. It won't match the first letter of the first name, the second letter of the second name, or the third letter of the third name, going on for infinity. This new name will be different from every name on the list. You will have created a brand new name within the already infinite set. This is called the power set of infinity. It may or may not be Aleph 1. For simplicity, we'll just call it Aleph 1. SCP-3125 is an idea that's high within this hierarchy of Aleph numbers, meaning SCP-3125 is at bare minimum Aleph 1. If you are still confused, I would highly suggest you watch Veritasium's video on how an infinite hotel ran out of room. Now, what does this all mean? Well, there's one thing I didn't mention. SCP-3125 is a concept so complex it's hard for people to grasp, much less comprehend. SCP-3125 is above conventional ideas, or simply put, SCP-3125 is an idea so complex it's above ideas like dimensionality. SCP-3125 would be infinitely above a concept such as dimensions. In Versus Battle Wiki terms, low 1A. For people who are still confused, just imagine it as a very strong, hostile concept that wants to destroy everything. I plan to do a future vid on this SCP alone, as it is complex and is the basis for a lot in the SCP universe. When the Scarlet King flipped the Noosphere, SCP-3125 was inside of it, meaning the Scarlet King flipped the very reality it exists in. The Scarlet King is above SCP-3125, and the Almighty is far above him. So at bare minimum, the Almighty is infinitely above dimensions. This is a lowball because SCP-3125 is higher in this hierarchy. Some people think that the Almighty is stronger based on its name. If you apply this logic, then Vegeta's Big Bang attack has the power of a Big Bang. Something's name does not define it. The Almighty is nothing compared to the number 4 spot. At number 4, I have the Overvoid Lurk. The Overvoid Lurk is the narrator and writer of Operation Overmeta. He exists on the Alpha layer and the main narrative simultaneously. The Alpha layer is the reality above the rest of the main story. Think of it as a fictional transcendency. So the Overvoid looks at everything as fiction, but is also in the main narrative at the same time. He looks at a being such as the Almighty as fiction and reality. The simple way of looking at it is that he is in between a fictional transcendency. If we go back to the image I showed earlier, the overvoid would be right in between the main narrative and the alpha layer. The overvoid can freely manipulate operation over meta. He forgets a name at one point and proceeds to rename the character. He rewrote the intro to the story multiple times. The characters comment on how people have stopped reading because of the number of retakes the overvoid did. They're all just trying to save their narrative from being forgotten and deleted. Meanwhile, the overvoid is doing 5 retakes of the intro to their story. The whole file is very meta and creative. Now, what does this all mean? It means he would be above the main narrative, including the infosphere. He looks at the hierarchy of Beyond Infinite concepts as fiction or close to it. Because the overvoid looks at the uncountably infinite hierarchy of beyond dimensional concepts as fiction, he would be in versus battle terms high 1A. The infosphere has infinite ideas, each beyond infinite size. The main wank that people throw on characters like this is that they are the writer, so they are omnipotent. The obvious counter to this is that we are not omnipotent, so they can't be either. You don't see people like Stan Lee collapsing a universe, but even more blatantly, they are fictional authors, not actual authors. Think of it like Toribot from Dragon Ball. Toribot is not Akira Toriyama, he is just an avatar. A better video on how omnipotence is contradictory in fiction is Omnipotence Explained by Surfbone. At number 3, I have SCP-001, Andrew Swan's Proposal. SCP-001, Andrew Swan's Proposal, also known as the Database, is a civilization that exists on the Alpha layer. These beings are the writers of the main narrative and are separate from it, unlike the Overvoid. These beings see the SCP universe in the same way we see a show like DBZ, as fiction. The Database is slightly above the Overvoid because of this. A common misconception about the Database is that it is us. The Database is not us, as it is fiction. The Database even interacts with the Foundation, and even gets destroyed by the next entry on this list. The Database is simply a fictional transcendency above the main narrative. The same scaling for the Overvoid applies to the Database, making it high 1A. People try to use the Omnipotence writer on this, but it does not apply for the same reason. This entry is a bit shorter as it is just the Overvoid but a bit stronger, but the next SCP is simultaneously weak and powerful. At number 2, I have SCP-2747. You might remember this SCP from my weakest SCPs video. In that video I mentioned this SCP at the end as it is weak and strong at the same time. SCP-2747 is an anti-narrative, which means it deletes narratives. SCP-2747 does this by adding elements to a story, and those elements delete themselves and the narrative along with it. 2747 was discovered by people talking about stories online, even though the stories appeared not to exist. SCP-2747 has only deleted lower narratives below the main narrative, but it can leak into higher narratives. SCP-2747 ascends through narratives by higher beings noticing the elements SCP-2747 puts in a story. It might have leaked into the main narrative with the Scarlet King being the element. In SCP-6747's file, it is heavily implied that SCP-6747-C is a form of SCP-2747. I mean, it literally shows SCP-2747 behind the file of SCP-6747-C. In that story, SCP-2747 deleted the alpha layer. There's only one problem with SCP-2747. If there's a higher narrative that can edit the narrative 2747 is in, it could remove the elements added by SCP-2747. 2747 can keep going higher and higher through narratives. You might be asking, how do you go beyond a narrative eater that climbs through narratives? Well, before we get to the number 1 strongest SCP, here are some honorable mentions. SCP-343 is a being claiming to be the Christian god, and the Christian god is omnipotent. I don't need to go over why it's contradictory once again. There are also Sephiroth and Klepoth, which are very confusing, and I might go over them in the future. I decided not to include them because I'm very indecisive on their scaling, and it contradicts the Almighty's narrative. From my understanding, these beings do not compare to the number 1 spot. At number 1, I have SCP-3812. SCP-3812 is one of, if not the most broken SCPs. SCP-3812, once known as Sam Howell, died in 1996 and later rose from the grave and then disappeared. You know, your average Thursday. It turns out Sam Howell was possessed by a higher dimensional being. This being was created by Ben, an entity in the alpha layer, and its purpose was to be strong. It achieved this goal way too well, as SCP-3812 went on to surpass Ben and the narratives far above him. There's only one problem SCP-3812 has. his mental health. Sam Howell has schizophrenia from being exposed to higher narratives. This causes SCP-3812 to become less and less humanoid as his perception of reality changes reality. Not only has his perception changed his appearance, but his perception has deleted concepts. Just because SCP-3812 is mentally ill does not mean he is not a threat. Whenever something attacks SCP-3812, SCP-3812 deletes it. He moves or he ignores it. Ben, SCP-3812's creator, tried to kill him with tungsten rods, plot manipulation, black holes, and he even tried to get duplicates to attack him. He ignored the rods and the plot manipulation and he just erased his duplicates. This went on for 3 days until Ben contacted the Foundation and said, "I'm sorry, I think I fucked up pretty badly this time. I've tried everything I can think of, but I can't undo him. I don't really understand how, but I think he's above me now, and whatever is above me too. Because whoever wrote my narrative isn't happy about this. I don't know where he's at now, but I think he exists in all of our realities simultaneously. Eventually he'll either reach the top or just keep going, and neither option is good. I'm going to keep looking for some way to fix this. You should too." SCP-3812 fictionally transcends any height. He fictionally transcended the alpha narrative and narratives far above that. A common misconception about SCP-3812 is that he's getting stronger and is not innately above things. This is contradicted by a post from DJ Cactus, the author of SCP-3812. In this post he says, "The single rule that governs his existence is a pretty simple one. If something exists that would supersede him for whatever reason, he would there immediately supersede it. The reason he's described as spiraling up is because he's also forced to attempt to supersede himself, crashing through narratives to try to get to a point where he would be higher than himself. SCP-3812 should fictionally transcend any height he comes across. This means beings like SCP-2747 cannot reach his narrative, because he will go above it. The mental instability of SCP-3812 after being exposed to higher narratives means he cannot take control of his powers very well, but any threat to him is deleted or he avoids. This makes containment of SCP-3812 impossible. 3812 looks at beings from Swan's proposal as fiction within a fiction within a fiction. 3812 will eventually supersede the infinite hierarchy of narratives to keep getting stronger. SCP-3812's alternate personality said to Sam Howell, "One sunny day we'll open our eyes and see nothing but creation below us and nothing above us but ourselves, spinning out wildly into the great above." This means SCP-3812 will eventually go infinitely above high 1A characters. This does not make him boundless, as to be boundless you have to be beyond an uncountably infinite number of transcendencies, so an inaccessible cardinal number of transcendencies. Simply put, think of the gap between high 1A and an inaccessible cardinal as the gap between a finite number and infinity. No matter how many times you add, you will not reach infinity. If you are curious about inaccessible cardinals, Vsauce's video goes a bit more in depth into it. Simply think of SCP-3812 as progressing towards being boundless. At the end of Sam Howell's conversation with the being that possessed him, Sam Howell gave up trying to kill the narrative Ben created, became sane again, and gained control over his power. This SCP is one of the most OP SCPs while simultaneously being one of the best reads. So I lied, there's one more that I want to talk about, but it's cheating. The true authors, or us. It's not in the main list because it's logically outside of the verse. We transcend even SCP-3812 because he's obviously fiction to us, and we are real, from my knowledge. The true authors would be something like DJ Cactus, who created Ben, the creator of SCP-3812. I just thought I would bring it up to make the distinction between us and the alpha layer, to make more sense. There were a lot of things I did not cover. I think this was even a lowball. For example, each branch on the Tree of Life supposedly has infinite multiverses, and each universe has infinite dimensions. I think my scaling of the infosphere was even a lowball too, as it might have even bigger concepts. There was a lot of conflicting info I found while researching. I guess that's what I get for researching this on Versus Battle and Quora, and just looking at debates. It made this video really hard to make. For context, I started this video around the beginning of April. I have resources in the description for the SCP's files and the concepts I went over in this video. The main thing to understand is alpha numbers, because going beyond infinity is kind of odd. And as briefly mentioned, you can go beyond that with inaccessible cardinals. Also keep in mind the power set of infinity is beyond infinity, but it may or may not be equal to alpha 1. I said it was for simplicity because I did not want to go into a deep dive into set theory. If you want to look more into the SCP verse, I would suggest you read the files yourself. They are interesting and you might have a different interpretation than me. I would especially recommend Vision at Batar and the Thing at the Bottom of My Dreams. I will more than likely in the future do a corrections video or even a part 2 once I'm more knowledgeable and have more scans. There is more than likely an SCP page that has 2 likes and is broken when taking into account the 6,000 plus entries. The big thing that made this video hard was Sephiroth and Klopov. The amount of debate around them is baffling, and I will eventually do a video on them once I figure them out. I plan to do a very large video on the SCP verse as a whole, on its scaling and its terminology, the ultimate guide so to speak. I have no idea when that will come out. It could be next year knowing me, but I want to do it right. If you like content like this, I do scaling for the SCP verse, Dragon Ball, and just generally whatever I feel like scaling. All I have to say is thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Psych, the video is not over. Yeah, this video is more than likely wrong in several areas, but not completely wrong. This is only looking at the English branch. There are other branches in different languages that have more OP SCPs, and I'm definitely going to have to do a part 2 as the SCP verse is much vaster than I thought it was. Okay, this is the actual end.